Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the final day of the Money Show Virtual Expo for accredited investors. We're excited to welcome David R. Kotok, who's the chairman and CIO of Cumberland Advisors, founded in 1973. His financial market commentaries have appeared in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and Mr. Kotok is a frequent guest of Bloomberg TV and radio. Mr. Kotok, thanks for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be back with the Money Show after 2 years of being in isolation. I hope by next year I'll be able to be back at an event in person. Let me just say a word or two about today. What we want to present today is a new set of slides that were prepared by an organization that is not in the financial markets. They are devoted to post-viral diseases, and they have developed great data systems on post-viral diseases and now on long COVID. In our work at Cumberland, we see the evolution of long COVID as a huge development worldwide, and particularly for the United States and for the US economy and for the financial markets. At Cumberland Advisors, we have strategies involved in stocks and bonds, which we are implementing for clients that involve the recognition of long COVID as a serious issue. We don't have time to talk about those strategies now. I'm welcome to respond to emails or questions or other things along the way. Let's get to long COVID and talk about what it is for a few minutes, and then we can talk about the implications for the financial markets and economy. And if there's time, I've agreed with Stephen to try to take a couple of questions through the chat format. Stephen, can you put up the next slide? So if you look at the slide for a minute, and Stephen is arranging for all these slides to be available to everybody on the call so that you'll be able to see them and absorb them when we have a little more time. This is the technical definition of long COVID. It is a post-viral disease. It has an acronym, as most things do, and it's PASC. So you'll see the technical term PASC as the description of long COVID. Let's get to the next slide. 2 years ago, there were no long COVID clinics in the United States. We didn't have the problem. They are evolving continuously as more and more cases evolve. And as more and more people in the healthcare system realize that this is a post-viral disease involving millions of people. This is a chart depicting how many post-COVID clinics are in the United States right now. The number continues to grow. Let's get to the next slide. There's a distribution of the country and the cases of post-COVID. Now remember, post-COVID is you got COVID. You may have been cured, you may have been treated, you may have had a mild case, and later you develop symptoms of partial, temporary, or permanent disability of various types. And this is an example of those cases. These are the folks who survived COVID, didn't die, with or without treatments, and then evidenced post-COVID symptoms. Next slide. So there's a depiction, a graphical distribution of cases in the UK. Why do we put up the UK? Because the United Kingdom has 67 million people and has a national health system and is able to track these cases, define them, and deal with the treatments. The UK is 6 to 9 months ahead of the United States when it comes to long COVID data. Why? Because we have 50 different states. We do it differently in the US. In many places, we don't even get a record of long COVID until somebody's hospitalized we have a hodgepodge of data. It's a weakness of the American system. It's awful when you compare it to other places in the world. So we put up the UK as a reference. Remember, in America, we have 5 times the population of the UK. Let's go to the next slide. So there's where we are in the US. These are projections. They are developing. This data is changing daily and weekly and monthly. Let's go to the next slide. There's a population study and estimate about cases. We don't know today how many cases will be in existence a year or 2 from now. What we do know is we're talking about a disease syndrome, post-viral, post-COVID disease that will measure in the millions of people. It already is. How many millions is an unknown. Next slide. So there's a range and estimate done by the Long COVID Initiative group. These are guesstimates, they're estimates, they're refined guesses as incoming data is absorbed, analyzed. These are constantly changing numbers. But clearly, when you think about the United States and its population of 335 million people, you can see how large an impact long COVID will be and already is. Next slide. There's a comparison between the UK and the US. Again, changing data. This is as of a few days ago, but all lines are headed in the direction you see. Let's go to the next slide. Now, there's a model which uses a different technique to estimate long COVID. And that's a good thing, because if we use 2 different approaches and we get close to the same information, that says we're close. Our estimates are close. They're not exact, and this is a changing environment, but they're close. Okay, that completes the slides. Let's go to the conversation, Stephen. Are you ready, Stephen?
Yes, sir.
Okay, well, thank you. So let's talk about what this is. If we have people who have COVID, regardless of age, and then subsequently they develop a characteristic which disables them, either temporarily, it could be a breathing disability, it could be some other symptom. What we're finding about long COVID in the medical research is that it is a blood disease. It can reach into all your organs. It's not just a respiratory flu or cold. Anybody who tells you that is not telling you the truth. So it's a substantial long-term post-viral condition that defines long COVID. And what we're seeing is this mechanism is now creating folks who are disabled in some way. They could be partially disabled, meaning they can work some of the time. They can function some of the time. They could be temporarily fully disabled for a period of time, and that's an unknown quantity. Yesterday, I was on a conference call with a law firm. One of the legal partners has been suffering long COVID symptoms. This particular law firm was located in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and he didn't know that the University of Pennsylvania Medical School has a long COVID clinic, which he does now, and he's on his way there. So when you think about this, you have to say, we have people, they are disabled in some ways, and they're diverse ways, and it all originates from COVID as the virus, various types of COVID, because we have variants of COVID. But what we are finding is 2 things. all COVID leads to long COVID cases, whether that's 10% of the people who get COVID, or 9 or 7 or 14, we don't know yet. The multiplier of a long COVID versus deaths is somewhere between 6 and 20 times. We use a number of 11, which would be a baseline center. It doesn't mean it's exact. That would suggest that with 1 million excess deaths from COVID right now in the United States, there's approximately 11 million people suffering from long COVID today. Some of them don't know it, and the medical system is just learning about long COVID. Let me get to the third condition, and then maybe we can have some Q&A time before our time is up. If you have a cohort of people in the country who have disabilities that weren't there 2 years ago, some of them are in the labor force, say between the ages of 15, 16, and their late 60s or 70. And that cohort is in the millions of people. And that explains why some have difficulty going back to work, and others have difficulty when they do go back to work and they have to take time off because they are ill. They are suffering from a disease, and the disease is post-viral, but it isn't visible. Now, if we had the same number of people with polio, for example, which I hope we never see, we would see them, and the country would galvanize around treatment and prevention because it would be visible. In the case of COVID and long COVID, it's invisible. You can't see it. And therefore, you have a mass of millions of people in the labor force, in the ages of the working population, that are partially or temporarily, and in many cases now, permanently disabled. I have spoken with people who are permanently disabled from long post-viral disease syndromes. It's not fun, and it requires a whole mechanism of treatment. The second aspect is when you take a chunk of people, millions of people, out of the labor force, you get a shock. Wages rise, pay levels rise. There's fewer people to do the work. So we see that in the labor force data. It's not monetary inflation from the Federal Reserve. It's payment for jobs when there aren't enough skilled people to fill them. And that only results in one thing. The economy must reprice labor at a higher level to reach some clearing equilibrium. Here's the third thing. You get new productivity gains in investments because you have to substitute the application of technologies for labor. Why? You don't have the people, and you have to do something, so you substitute capital investment for labor. That has huge investment implications. And stocks in certain industries and groups and sectors are performing the way they are because of it. So what we have is this, and I can sum it up in a minute or two, and we may have time for a question or two. We have a massive shock. It originates in a pandemic. They come along every 50 or 100 years, and we are ill prepared for them. And we have been ill prepared for this one. The last one was 1957-58 with the Asian flu. And before that, it was the Spanish flu from 1917, 18, 19, 20, and 21, although everybody thinks of that as 1918 because of John Barry's book. I might point out that in 57 and 58, a president of the United States by the name of Dwight Eisenhower, immediately ordered and vaccinated 17% of the population. He vaccinated the entire military establishment, all of defense contractors, and the government. Why? He was a general, the winner in World War II, and he knew he couldn't fight wars against enemies with a sick army. There was no anti-vax. There was no discussion about this political debate, which is ripping apart our country. Eisenhower did it in 1957. There are precedents for such things. Unfortunately, they don't make the top of the news. Bottom line on long COVID, this is a developing situation. It's worsening. It involves millions of people, and it is an economic and therefore financial market shock. There are winners and there are losers that come out of it. Stephen, I hope I have time for a question or two. You're the moderator, so you're in charge.
Well, thank you very much. That was a fascinating presentation, and we do have several questions here. So our first one from Richard here is, what treatment modalities are on the horizon for PACs?
Well, there are a number of them in the works. Not any have developed to the point of having serious phase 2-3 trials and approvals. This is a relatively new disease. There's a bunch of folks working on it. So today, for long COVID, you have to have symptomatic treatment and you have to be followed very closely. There are many people who are not, and that's unfortunate. And there are many people who don't even know there's long COVID clinics which are sharing data. And so we would say to anybody who has residual COVID symptoms, find the nearest long COVID clinic and become enrolled in the database so you can be talking to people who can help you. There is evidence that vaccination reduces long COVID and helps suppress it. That is developing statistics with very strong support. Stephen?
All right, thank you. Next question here. Some stats say more Americans have died of COVID this year versus last year in spite of the vaccine. Why is that?
Well, the statistical base on deaths has two components to it. One is a direct confirmed COVID case. The other is what's called excess deaths. Those are deaths which are above the population demographic baseline that we have had right through February of 2020, but they're not directly attributable to COVID. An example, I live in Florida. In 6 counties in Florida at the beginning of COVID, there were a lot of cases. They were all logged by the coroners as pneumonia. So they don't fall in the COVID database. What we do know is we have some treatments now. We have vaccination that is having a suppressing effect. So the statistical business of deaths is a very difficult one, but it's getting better. Now you have to say, why are we having so many deaths? It really is in the unvaccinated population. 90-some%, almost 100% of the people who are hospitalized with severe COVID symptoms or die are unvaccinated. The vaccination systems with the boosters helps you fight the disease. Doesn't keep you from getting it. You get it through your nose and your mouth. But once it's in you, vaccination helps save your life. Very powerful, great new technologies in medicine. Next question, Steve.
All right, Richard asks, do most disability insurance policies cover PACs?
Oh man, is this a big one? The defined disabilities do not have contemplation of long COVID. We haven't seen, that's evolving now. So the answer is maybe yes and maybe no. And I believe the next shock in medical costs and disability costs will come through the insurance payments. Premiums will have to go up through the disability definitions. We now have one from the Department of Health and Human Services. By the way, our definition in the US is slightly different from the one used in the UK, which is slightly different from other places, but long COVID is new. So as it's characterized and defined, we'll have more disability definition and therefore coverage, and it will have a price attached to it. Next question.
All right, thank you. Are there particular companies trying to develop treatments to address the problems which would present investment opportunities?
Absolutely, yes. The biotech space, the pharma space, the technological space that is in the medical area, the healthcare area. In our portfolio structure at Cumberland, in our managed accounts, we are over market weight in this sector. And we have a diversified approach because we use exchange traded funds to get to it, because we're not sure to bet on a single stock. So we want the baskets. There are absolutely tremendous investment opportunities in the healthcare sector. And my view is it's going to be huge because it's going to have millions of people who are going to need the services, devices, and treatments coming from the healthcare sector. Stephen?
All right, thank you. What technologies would benefit most from what you're suggesting?
Well, biotech is tech. The whole notion of thinking about the technology sector only in computing, only in payments, or only in cryptocurrencies is missing the fact that medicine, treatment, the development, prevention, prophylaxis, vaccination, devices is technology at work in a huge way. We are changing how we do everything in healthcare from what we did only 2 to 3 years ago. How many people on this call have now done a telemedicine interview with their physician or nurse practitioner? And 3 years ago, it was unthinkable. So this is a massive, rapidly changing sector. Stephen?
How does long COVID relate to other difficult to diagnose post-infection diseases like ME, CFS, chronic Lyme, fibromyalgia, etc.?
Whoever asked that question, I want to hug you and take you to dinner. That is a critical question. And the reason that I use the slides from the long COVID initiative is that they are partnering with an organization that has years of research and data, which is called Solve ME, or chronic fatigue syndrome. So they have a database, and they were dealing with several 100,000 cases. Along came COVID, and now there are millions of post-viral cases. So they were very kind enough to provide their database for this call. This is the first time these slides are being seen by anybody. I have a presentation tomorrow, so they will become more public. They are free and they can be distributed and talked about. There's a website for the long COVID initiative on the slides, which I would invite people to be in touch with. Stephen?
What percentage of long COVID is temporary versus permanent?
We don't know how much is temporary, how much is partial and has a long period, and how much is permanent. This is a learning proposition now. We are seeing every month, every week, every day, more and more cases. And one of the problems is the cases arise, people have a medical problem. They go to see someone, whether it's a cardiologist or a pulmonologist or a neurologist or some other ologist. And when they're done, they're being treated symptomatically for the type of symptom. And the association that the holistic source of this is COVID is just spreading in the medical community now. That's why the development of these long COVID clinics is such an important development for medical care in the United States. Stephen?
Is there any idea how often a post-COVID patient must be revaxxed to address long COVID?
I don't think anybody knows vaccination repetition for long COVID patients. That's under studies now. I haven't seen in any of the reporting that question can be answered definitively. Stephen?
Do you have any thoughts on the markets heading into the end of the year?
Oh my, the markets are dealing with two issues. Omicron and how it's unfolding. By the way, it is about 3.5 to 4 times more transmissible than Delta on early indication. This is not conclusive, but we have some warning signs. It may not be any more lethal than Delta. That's another early indication. But of course, for unvaccinated people, Omicron is exceptionally dangerous. We are now seeing reports of super spreading events, and I fear we are in for a surge in the United States that will be blistering fast and skyrocketing in cases, and therefore some of them will require hospitalizations and some of them will be dead, and most of the people will be the unvaccinated population. So that's how it looks to me. The markets are grappling with Omicron. Number one, they're grappling with the Federal Reserve pivot, what to do. And I believe inside the Fed right now, there's a debate about what to do with the tapering, because Omicron has thrown a curveball at the Fed policy. Does the Fed want to accelerate a tightening system in the midst of a surge of the virus, which is suppressing the economy, say in January and February? This is a tough debate. So Fed pivot and Omicron are the two big items in the market. Meanwhile, the market is showing a positive response to earnings growth. The third quarter of this year, the S&P 500 index had $54 in GAAP reported earnings. Remarkable. Nobody expected it. And the trajectory of that earnings increase rise looks to be intact and will do so. Why? Companies are profitable, are getting productivity investments, and the cost of funds, interest rates, is very, very low. So our outlook for the market is highly volatile. We've already seen it. Two shocks. What does the Fed do? And what happens with Omicron? And what does next year look like? Because it becomes a political year. And in the United States, that's a mess under the best circumstances. I hope that helps, Stephen.
That does. Thank you very much. And we have another question here. What biotech ETFs should we research?
Oh my, there's a bunch of them. I would look at the contents of them, the weights of the stocks in them. In our firm in Cumberland, we own biotech and we own it through the ETFs model. And we look at the contents of each ETF. There are several, so it would take me an hour to deliver a lecture on that. But you want to look at the companies, the weights, what those companies are doing, exactly how they're applying the technology, and then make an informed decision about the basket. I'm a believer in the basket rather than a single bet. It's a great thing if you can bet on the right stock the day before they announce the discovery, but I don't know how to do that. So a basket of them says I'm in the right territory, and all I need is one of them to succeed, and I want them to, for both public health and for the investment merit. I hope that helps, Stephen.
It does. Thank you. And our next question, how do we find a long COVID clinic?
Okay, so you can start with long COVID clinic and Google, and you'll get a list of 40 or 50 of them at once. You can go to the long COVID organization and ask them to help you find them. They have a master list, which they are updating continuously. If you look in the slides, you'll see that there are long COVID clinics in nearly all 50 states. By the time we get to the middle of next year, it's hard for me to visualize there won't be a long COVID clinic in every hospital system in the country. It has to come. Millions of people are going to suffer from a disease and need knowledgeable help. Stephen?
All right, thank you. And for our last question, do you think we've already reached peak inflation or we still have higher to go?
Well, this is a very fascinating debate over transitory, which I'm not supposed to use anymore. I never thought transitory would become a 4-letter word, but I guess it is. I'm not so sure inflation goes higher for a long period of time, because the history of pandemics from the very beginning, when you had the Pharaoh, the Peloponnese War, Sparta, states in the 7th to today, especially have wage spikes because you have fewer people. You have new capital investment because you have to make up for the loss of the people. And the inflation spike rolls over and subsides. And in fact, there's a Federal Reserve study out of the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco that established that in the 19 recorded pandemics of the last 700 years, the real interest rate fell after the shock, and a recession or slowdown followed every single shock. Are we going to have one now? We'll find out, but history suggests inflation goes back down to a lower single-digit number, although it may take a while to get there. My own view is 2.5%, 3% inflation, probably when things settle down. And that's a basis on which we are making some market projections. That means interest rates go above 0, but they don't go back to 5 and 6 and 7%. It's not going to happen so early, so quickly. That's an opinion. That and 50 cents gets you lousy used coffee at a Starbucks. Stephen?
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Kotok. That was a fascinating presentation. We really appreciate your time today.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
And thank you to everyone for joining us. Please stay tuned for our next session, Making Money with No Fracking, No Pipelines, and No Federal Lands.